Hello, I'm award-winning science communicator and pre-Malone, Kyle Hill. Should you still be wearing a mask? Many of you may feel like the pandemic is nearing an end, like life is returning to normal. So is it now safe to go around and go to whatever people who go outside do things without a mask on? Well, before we get too deep into it, yes. In most circumstances, you should still be wearing a mask, especially if you're around unvaccinated people that you know of, especially if you're indoors, especially if you're around crowds. The reason is evolution. But first of all, what are viruses anyway? Well, viruses, it's hard to define them in the context that we're usually familiar with. It's an open question whether or not viruses are actually alive. They do replicate, they find hosts, other living hosts to interact with, and they do evolve, but it's hard to say whether or not they are truly alive. What we do know for sure is that they evolve, and evolution is the driver of this pandemic and why you should still be wearing a mask. Every organism on this earth evolves, and the engine of that evolution is random mutation. When organisms are dividing and replicating, every single time that happens, in every single cell, every single birth, there is some insertion of randomness. Some mutations, things that can go wrong in the genetic code of these organisms. Most of the time, just statistically, these random mutations will either do nothing or will be harmful to the organism that has these mutations. Organisms can be very complicated things like you and me, and so tinkering around with genetic blueprints can cause disease or death or some problems when the embryo is forming. But every so often, one of these random events will produce a mutation and then go on to be expressed by the organism that will benefit this organism. A classic example of this is, say, many millions of years ago, there was a horse-looking thing that was trying to eat leaves in trees high up. Then some random mutations came along, and by chance alone, some of the populations of these horses started having slightly longer necks. These slightly longer necks allowed these horses to better compete with the other populations. Eventually, millions of years later, they became so dominant with their genetic blueprint and what allowed them to do that it became the dominant genetic blueprint, and these horses, or proto-horses, or things with hooves, eventually became giraffes. This is how evolution works. Every time a genetic code is copied or replicated, there is some chance some beneficial mutation will help the organism pass along its genes more frequently and outcompete other genetic blueprints that are in the other organisms and eventually become the dominant gene in this gene pool. That's how evolution progresses along. And you can actually see this happening in real time in bacteria, or you can simulate it with computers. So here, for example, is a fun computer simulation that you can run online for yourself. Here we are looking through a population of 1,000 little stick figures. And the goal of these stick figures is to move forward faster in 15 seconds than any other of these randomly created stick figures. If the stick figures are moving backwards, that's bad. If they're not moving very fast, that's bad. Some of these stick figures look weird, but that's the point. Random mutations might be the engine for evolution, but the real key to get that engine running is natural selection. So we're opposing some kind of natural selection on these little stick figures. We want them to move quickly and not backwards. So we run the simulation, and then, after that, we choose the organisms that did the best. We sort them from fastest to slowest. And then, because we're simulating natural selection, we say the bottom 500 slowest of these random organisms didn't survive. They were either eaten or they didn't pass on their genes as much as the other organisms did. So now you have the randomly faster organisms moving on through the generations. And if you continue this process of random mutation that might give a faster organism or not, plus natural selection killing off the organisms that are slow in this context, you see that over time, our simulated evolution is pushing these random little stick figures towards better and better times, being faster and faster. You can think of our giraffes again. All those little stick figures could be a bunch of little proto-horses, and then you randomly had some with different length necks. If natural selection was then selecting for longer necks to get at the leaves and high trees, then you can see over many, many generations, thousands and thousands, if not millions of years, necks could get longer. Now, I say all of that to say this. Viruses themselves evolve, and they evolve inside of you. Every time a virus replicates inside of your own cells to make more of itself, that introduces that genetic randomness. Now you have random mutations that could, in theory, make the virus deadlier or more transmissible or more contagious. It turns out that COVID-19 has a very low mutation rate, but here's the problem. When millions and millions, when the entire planet full of humans is getting infected with a single disease, that is billions upon billions of opportunities for this virus to mutate in a way that's potentially beneficial to it. And indeed, this is already what happened. You may have heard in the news of the so-called Delta variant. It's highly transmissible and it's very contagious, and it's something to look out for. It could be the dominant strain of COVID-19 in the United States very soon. This happened because of evolution. This Delta variant is basically just your horse with a slightly longer neck. With so many opportunities to evolve inside of people, COVID-19 mutated randomly, was naturally selected for, and this Delta variant sprung out. The good news is that if you're fully vaccinated against COVID-19, this vaccine shows very good results against this new Delta variant. But this is why you should still wear a mask. We are trying to remove the potential number of people that can be engines of evolution. We want as few people as possible to be that opportunity to introduce randomness into the system, to create more variants. Every person who doesn't get vaccinated, every time you don't mask up in public when you should, that is an opportunity for evolution to work its magic, to help these viruses evolve. There's no will to evolution. It doesn't want to make terrible viruses. It's just what happens. So the only thing that you can do to really combat it is to remove yourself or as many people as possible from this chain of evolution. Now, I know, depending on where you live and who you talk to, it may seem like the pandemic is over or not a big problem, but even if you can find a lot of people who look like you and sound like you, you need to know the broader context here. We have not fully vaccinated humans against COVID-19. Many underrepresented communities are at greater risk. Not everyone has the same access to vaccines. No matter what it feels like on Twitter and social media to you, we have not beaten this thing yet. We are not out of the woods. And despite what organizations like the CDC say, the World Health Organization and many experts around the world agree that continuing to mask and social distance before this pandemic is over is the best way to help prevent the spread of these new highly transmissible variants like the Delta variant, and to help rein in the possibility of new variants in the future. And like any science story, of course, it gets more complicated from here. We aren't sure exactly how the variants are multiplying in people who are vaccinated or unvaccinated and how this evolutionary process is going. But what we do know for sure is that even if you are vaccinated, you can still be infected. And once you're infected, that genetic replication process happens. So even if you're fully vaccinated, even if people who look and sound like you say the pandemic is over, it's not, and you still need to wear a mask. Think of your multicellular brothers and sisters on this one. So even though these stories can be murky and hard to wade through like a swamp of misinformation, try to follow the science as best you can, mask up, social distance, and let's rein this thing in before evolution does what it does best. Thanks for watching.